Very happy to be speaking at the 5th Annual International Conference of Caesurae Collective, sponsored by ICSSR ERC. My topic is translating mantra, opportunities and impossibilities in the translation of Saundarya Lahari, Wave of Beauty. Saundarya Lahari is a devotional hymn to the primordial goddess Shakti. The word Shakti refers to power. In the form of the primordial goddess, Shakti is the power of the divine feminine and creative principle that is present in and embodied by all creation. She is present in human beings, both male and female. Saundarya Lahari describes Shakti's physical form and her aniconic form, the Sri Yantra. Sri Yantra is a diagram of 9 interlocking triangles that create 43 triangles. In ritual worship, the worshipper's contemplation moves from the outer perimeter of the yantra to the center. In Saundarya Lahari, the goddess's physical form is described from head to toe and becomes a methodology for contemplation. Saundarya means beauty, and Lahari is that which has waves, and this may be why some translate the word as flood, tide, or even ocean. That which has waves is also a big wave, and Saundarya Lahari is one ginormous wave. Therefore, my title is in the singular, Wave of Beauty, and recognizes the unity of these 100 stanzas of singular beauty. Believed to have been composed by Adi Shankara, 8th century CE, this hymn in 100 or 103 stanzas is reputed for its mystical and magical effects. Saundarya Lahari is a complex and coded mantra, a revelation and sound formula. Over the centuries, it has become a tradition in itself, with over 35 commentaries propounding esoteric meanings and coded mantras and bijaksharas. The chanting of Saundarya Lahari is popular in contemporary India as a devotional practice and typically a part of the learning for those who practice a tantra, a doctrine and a mode of worship called Sri Vidya. Thus, tantra, mantra, yantra, Sri Yantra, Sri Vidya, not including all the other terms that begin to crowd my notebook of untranslatability. Translating terminology. Terms, I have found, are the most challenging part of working with religious philosophical texts. A term is a word or phrase that describes a thing or concept connected with a particular type of language or an area of study. Terms have specific contexts. How to differentiate chitta, manas, buddhi, especially if one is translating this line, mano buddhi ahankara chitta ninaham. If jnana is knowledge, what is vijnana? Swabhava and guna may both be translated as qualities and are used interchangeably in common parlance, but guna is also a specific term in Indian thought that refers to one of the 3 gunas constituting prakriti or nature. I tend to turn to the commonsensical wisdom of Ludwig Wittgenstein. The meaning of a word is in its use. The only way to be certain about how to translate what is to develop familiarity with the context or area studies that helps recognize how a term is being used. Common terms in Sanskrit may have varied usages in tantric terminology, and one needs to be cautious about Hindu Tantra versus Buddhist Tantra. Saundarya Lahari is a part of Hindu Tantra. In spite of a few centuries of translation between Sanskrit and English, there are still no solutions defined for the task. Bharati surmises that the fault is in the elitism of source and target cultures. He writes, traditional Western philosophers who excluded Indian thought from their study as below philosophical dignity and whose attitude was reciprocated by the Orientalist brand of counter-arrogance, that Western philosophy was lacking the spiritual insight which could help it tackle the esoteric problems of Asian thought. Problems like these call for a much larger and collective effort, somewhat like the rigorous project taken on by Tibetan Buddhists translating Sanskrit texts. Coming back to my drawing board, if I translated terms too simplistically, I could be guilty of, or just accused of, appropriation. And if I do not translate a term at all, of elitism or foreignization. Then there is a twisted compromise of translationese, such as hyphenated words and distorted English in an attempt to be literal. Discussing the problem in the essay Making Sanskritic or Making Strange, How Should We Translate Classical Hindu Texts? W. J. Johnson writes, there are arguments about deliberately disorientating the English reader to preserve the otherness of the other culture and so avoid Orientalist appropriations. There is also the hope that you can inject interesting new idioms into English prosody by adopting this method. But in all such cases, it seems to me that you end up with something more strange than Sanskritic. In fact, such strategies deny the possibility of equivalence and through their deliberate otherness recommend departure from it. I concur with Johnson. Additionally, I also choose to display the beauty and include the resonance of some of the terms in Soundarya, and for this I often incorporate the Sanskrit term into my translation. I consider my role to be that of bridging, to help the reader become familiar with the context through the reading of the poem. It is contextually that we learn the usage of words. Further, my search is also for a vocabulary that fits the pace and flow of a poem translation. I need to translate the line within the flow of the poem. Here is how I translated mudra. Shloka 4. Except you, the droves of gods do mudras, mystic hand signals, Abhaya mudra to make fearless, Varada mudra to give boons. I explain more in the end note to this stanza. Thus, the gloss is integrated into the translation and the end note presents a deeper explanation. The translated stanza mentions the term and its meaning, and even within the flow of the reading becomes a quick lesson on two specific mudras. The reader now knows that Abhaya mudra means to make fearless and Varada mudra means to give boons. I use parentheses where my voice interrupts the flow and no parentheses for what I consider just the complete translation. Here is another example. Shloka 100. Like waving light to the sun with the light of a flame, Nirajanam. Like offering water from a moonstone to the moon, source of nectar, Arghyam. Like trying to satiate the ocean with its own water, Tarpanam. O Mother, these words of praise, Saundarya Lahari, are your words. I retain the Sanskrit terms and they punctuate the lines in such a way that the translation seems like a homage to the ritual. Meanwhile, the reader has also learned What is Nirajanam, Arghyam, and Tarpanam? I thought that my translation would speak to general readers who may not have a background of the philosophical idea of Tantra. I suppose them to be heritage learners, either Indian themselves or interested in Indian ideas. The book translation would also be a learning tool for first encounters with Saundarya Lahari or its meaning. Interestingly, even though Saundarya Lahari is considered a mantra, the word mantra is not mentioned once in the poem, nor Sri Yantra. It is I who include the words Sri Yantra and even Yoni in parentheses in verse 19 when I explain Bindu. I assume that the reader has read the introduction. The end note, which is simple, elaborates. But even if a reader has not turned to the end notes, they get a contextual understanding of a yoni. Are names terms? Sometimes. There are numerous names in the poem. Names of gods Shiva, Shakti, Vishnu, Rudra, Kama, Rati, Indra. Names of trees Kadamba, Ashoka. Names of places Kailasha, Manidvipa. One of the joys of Indian languages is how names explain themselves. They may describe an action or attitude and contain an entire story. When Shakti is called Chandi, it immediately conjures her victory over demonic Chanda. How a character got a name is a story template in itself, and this is why characters have multiple names. When understood literally, Manidvipa is the Dvipa or the island of Manis, that is gems, which it is, except there is more to it. And Kama is the name of the god of love but also means desire, and one does not know which came first. Names can have footnotes if felt necessary. Some names also have scope for double entendre. The place called Vishala also means expansive, and the place called Kalyani also means auspicious. I do not translate names even when they can be translated. In particular, within the context of mantras, I align with the idea in Indian thought that names are sonic forms of physical matter. Names, thus, are like mantras, and they are mantras. They evoke the presence of the person who is being named. In such a poem as Saundarya Lahari, where the sounds and resonances create the effects, the presence of the original names in my translation has proved orchestral, carrying the aura of the hymn and creating an acoustic surround. Of course, I do not translate Shiva or Shakti. The introduction and the entire poem explains who or what they are. Notice how both names begin with the same syllable, followed by different vowels. Translating Saundarya Lahari calls for an awareness at multiple levels: context, stanza, line, word, syllable. Some names seem sudden, without a backdrop of known usage, like when the poet calls Shakti Triloki in stanza 19. While this literally means she who is of three worlds or lokas, it must also refer to the concept of Tripura, three cities, and yet really feels like an endearment or pet name. But I did not translate the name as goddess of three worlds because it was used like a name. Instead, the role as cosmic personality was important in the line, I thought. The translation thus goes, makes Triloki dizzy, the cosmic woman whose breasts are the sun and moon. By now, my goals may be obvious. Nevertheless, let me spell it out before proceeding to the next section. 1. I am producing a poem translation, not a commentary. 2. My reader is the general reader who may not have a background of the philosophical ideas of Tantra. 3. Most of my readers are Indian or interested in Indian ideas. They are heritage learners. The book translation would also be a learning tool for first encounters with Saundarya Lahari or its meaning, after which readers may or may not move on to commentaries. A little digression on commentaries. Sanskrit texts, which are in the form of sutras, are typically understood with the help of a commentary or bhashya. Sutras are aphoristic, terse, and may even seem like fragments of notes or sound bites of conversations between erudite scholars. While there are various definitions of the functions of a commentary, in general it includes word breaks, padacheda, word meaning, padarthokti, grammatical analysis, vigraha, sentence construction, vakya yojana, and even responses to readers' potential objections and confusion, akshepa samadhana. Commentaries are highly nested, that is, often there are commentaries on commentaries. This is not always an indication of the impenetrability of a source text. It could also be how one commentator associates themselves with previous commentators. It's a declaration of lineage. The more valued a text is, the more the commentaries and even arguments between commentators. Saundarya Lahari has over 35 commentaries just in Sanskrit and which perform all these functions and explain references to tantric concepts and plumb deeper meanings, gudharthas. The problem of mantra and meaning. Mantras are codified sounds, sound formulae, clusters of syllables or words and lines uttered aloud or silently during religious rituals or contemplative practice. They are revelations, natural sound forms intuited by seers or rishis in meditative states. A mantra's sound has effects and results that manifest in the material world. The meaning of words, if any, in a mantra are regarded peripheral, more useful as aids to concentration, directed will, that is sankalpa, or memorization, and for the production of devotional intensity, that is bhava. Mantras are typically considered and meaningful in ways that are not discursive, in short, untranslatable. But if mantras have no discursive meanings, why do commentaries exist? The meaning of mantras is vehemently defended in Vedic hermeneutics and scholastic debates dated back to the 2nd century CE Shabra Bhashya, which is a commentary on Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutras of 4th century BCE. In Nirukta 1.15 to 1.16, etymologist Yaskacharya of 1st century CE asserts that Shruti, revelations, scriptures, has meaning because it uses the same words as ordinary language. 17th century CE scholar and seer Bhaskara Raya, regarded as the most significant commentator on Saundarya Lahari, writes about ritualists who do not understand the meanings of mantras they perform. They are like donkeys with sandalwood loads on their back, oblivious to the value of what they carry. He also likens not knowing meanings of mantras to offering oblations into a pile of ash. Backed by such powerful friends in the history of religious thought, a translator can breathe free when working with mantras at the level of discursive meaning. Saundarya Lahari has a descriptive narrative, and many stanzas include a conceit and detail within that conceit to lend it realism. From stanza 42 to 91, the poet describes the perfect, beautiful physical form of the goddess. Her eyes are reminiscent of fish, her breasts are the sun and the moon, navel like a still whirlpool, and so on, helping connect Shakti to all of nature. Therefore, translation is entirely possible and wholly valid for the discursive narrative level of the poem. How to integrate other depths then becomes the challenge. The problem of invisible mantras. The complexity of Soundarya is the various levels of mantras. 1. The stanza is a mantra. 2. There are mantras represented by code words. And 3. Mantras embedded within the words and lines. That is, there may be a sensible meaning at the level of word but not at the level of the line. According to 5th century CE language philosopher Bhartrhari, meaning gathers with sentences or lines and bursts like a spore, sphota. Thus, when we see a series of words that seem to have no relationship with each other and do not add up to any sense, we know it is a list or it is a code. And how do we know the code? We do not. We rely on adepts. The commentators of Soundarya are regarded as tantric adepts who decipher the meaning and assert what is meant, and this is accepted by others. It is a convention. There is also a tradition called mantrodhara, where an adept or seer may extract mantras from mantras. These may also vary from commentator to commentator. After all, different seers have different visions. According to commentator Kaivalyashrama, the very first verse indicates the mantras Prasada, Anuttara, Matrika, Vagvadini, Shaiva Panchakshari, and Pashadi Trayakshari. Other commentators have extracted other mantras. When there are multiple truths, whom does one choose? I do not go to the level of embedded mantras except for the primary mantra considered Sri Vidya, the heart of the entire teaching, and the mantra that, upon fruition, confers liberation. This is stanza 32. The series of nouns in the first two lines refer to Shiva, Shakti, Kama, the god of love, earth, sun, cool rays, moon, Smara, another name for Kama, Swan or realized being, Shakra, which is Indra, Brahma, Mara, again Kama, and Shiva. Our codes for these syllables Ka, E, I, La, Ha, Sa, Ka, Ha, La, Sa, Ka, La. Further, the stanza tells us that these three sets are linked by the syllable Hrim. Add the syllable Shrim and you also have the other top secret mantra, the Shodashi or 16-syllabic mantra. Here is my translation that shows the derivation. Shloka 32. Mother, linked by three Hrim, these decoded syllables formulate the parts of your name. Kaila Hrim, Hasakahala Hrim, Sakala Hrim. Ka from Shiva, A from Shakti, E from love, La from earth, Hrim. And Ha from sun, Sa from moon, Ka from love, Ha from swan, a realized being, La from Indra, chief of the gods, Hrim. And again Sa from Brahma, Ka from love, La from Vishnu, Hrim. This stanza is not a translation of the words but of their import as accepted in the tradition. I show how these syllables are derived by spelling out the equivalences. Now, some may argue that one must never do a mantra without initiation and one must not even utter it. But we are in the era of YouTube and digital information. If I do not include it in my translation, the reader can quite as easily type in Panchadashi mantra on the internet and find out what it is. 2. Since mantras do not work without initiation, there is nothing to fear. Instead, I say what it is and reiterate in the introduction and other lectures that it is futile to do it without initiation. At the end of the day, information is not the same as knowledge. Translating invisibles. There are multiple manuals and handbooks in many languages, including English, and which include translations of the verses as well as commentaries and religious prescriptions. Each mantra is associated with a yantra and a syllable that must be repeated a specific number of times. For instance, stanza 1 is associated with shreem, which must be drawn on a plate and repeated 1,000 times daily for 12 days. Did I carry the syllable over into my translation? How do I prove it, and how does anyone disprove it? If I make such a claim, it would be unfalsifiable. How to evaluate if what we are told is invisible is invisibly present? You can only judge for yourself. Whereas I can offer no evidence that I have embedded secret syllables into my translation, I can point out the visible and tangible elements that work towards particular resonances. One of them is how I try to move the connotations into the translation. Here is an example from stanza 2. Even a fleck of a speck of dust from your feet, pollen dust from your lotus feet. Here is the Sanskrit line. Taniyam sampam sum tavacharana pankeruha bhavam. Here is a word by word meaning. Slenderest, pollen dust, your feet, lotus. The word charana, foot, feet, belongs to both the words before and after the tavacharana and charana pankeruha, feet lotuses. The word for lotus is pankeruha, which literally means that which grows in the dirt. The comparison in the line is between Shakti's feet and lotuses and between dust and pollen. Of course, there is dust on feet. But these are not regular feet. They are like lotuses. Untouched by the dirt they stand in. The movement of the translation teases out the double entendre and shows off the clever setup of the Sanskrit original. Another instance of a double entendre is stanza 22. The word Bhavani is an address meaning O Goddess, and it is also a verb in the first person. Bhavani Tvam can mean I must become you. Here is the Sanskrit line. Bhavani Tvam dase mai vitaradrishtim sakarunamiti stotum vanchan kathayati. Here is my translation which explains the humor. Even before he who wants to praise says, O Bhavani, extend a compassionate look at your servant, you hear the first part, Bhavani Tvam, may I be you. Another device I use is the tripartite division within stanzas, and this is true of most of the stanzas. Such a structure carries the idea or aura of the concept of three. The particular goddess that Soundarya adores is Lalita Tripura Sundari, where Tripura Sundari means beauty of three cities. The word Pura, cities, has been interpreted in numerous ways, among which one notes how the goddess equals the trinity of male deities, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, or how Tripura refers to the three states of consciousness, waking, dream, and deep sleep. Finally, I did not even attempt to replicate the meter. Soundarya isn't Shikharini meter, a line of 17 syllables where the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the 12th, the 13th and 17th syllables of a foot, pada, are heavy, guru, while the rest of the syllables are light, laghu. More than copying the meter, I chose to focus on the fact that the poem flows without pause. Similarly, my translation must flow, not just within the stanza, but across the entire 100 verses. There are multiple waves within my composition, and they add up to the big wave. My methodology was to first read the mantra and the commentaries and do japa, repetitive utterance of the mantra. It was only when I could perceive its vibrance within or with my body that I took pen to paper for translation. It was as simple as it was visceral. Is it even possible that the gods only understand Sanskrit? Mantras are not only in Sanskrit. What transports the seeker and creates a connection with the energy of the deity in any language is a mantra. It is translatable. As the very last verse reminds us, O Mother, these words of praise, Saundarya Lahari, are your words.